Picture yourself in an open cockpit biplane in 1935. Wind is hammering your face mask, your goggles are rattling, and your hands are locked around a machine gun that sounds like someone is slicing the sky in half with a chainsaw. That gun is the Vickers K. Before it became famous on the ground, it was designed to kill from the air. The Vickers K, officially known as the Vickers Gas Operated, or VGO, rolled out of the Vickers Armstrong factory in 1935 as a defensive gun for aircraft observers. Britain needed something lighter than the old standard Vickers water-cooled gun, but much faster than the Lewis gun that had been used since the First World War. The Royal Air Force wanted rear gunners and observers to stand a chance against the new, faster German fighters that were showing up in the mid-1930s. The answer they built was extreme for its time. Engineers took a proven gas system, shaved off every bit of extra weight they could, and tuned the internals to cycle at a speed that almost sounded fake for that era. The numbers were ridiculous. A normal infantry light machine gun like the Bren fired about 500 rounds a minute. Even the scary German MG-34, which people feared for its speed, peaked at around 900 rounds per minute. The Vickers K could spit out 950 to 1,200 rounds a minute in its standard setup. Now here's where it gets crazy. British armorers later adjusted the gas regulator and lightened some parts for ground combat use. Those tuned guns in special operations units were clocked at around 2,400 rounds per minute. That's 40 shots every second. Think about that. You could dump a 100-round drum in just over 2 seconds if you simply held the trigger down and let it scream. Despite that violence, the gun by itself weighed only about 21 pounds with no ammo. That's shockingly light for something that violent. It fired the same .303 British round used in standard infantry rifles and machine guns, which made resupply easier. And it had a quick-change barrel, which absolutely mattered because at those fire rates, the barrel could start glowing red almost immediately. The designers at Vickers knew an air gunner in a fight couldn't stop and let a hot barrel cool. So they made the barrel removable in seconds. You could pop off a red-hot tube and slide in a cool one in under 10 seconds, even with thick gloves on at high altitude. But the detail that really made the Vickers K stand out was its top-mounted pan magazine. Instead of using belts, the Vickers K was fed by round drum magazines that sat on top of the gun, either 60 rounds or 100 rounds per drum. That idea came from the older Lewis gun design, but Vickers improved it a lot. The spring-driven feed system inside those drums was more dependable at weird angles, which mattered if you were firing from a banking bomber turret or, later, off a jeep bouncing across rocks at 40 miles per hour. By 1937, the Vickers K had become common defensive armament in RAF bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Rear gunners in ferry battles, Bristol Blenheims and early Wellingtons trusted it to fight off incoming Messerschmitt Bf-110s and early Bf-109s. The gun earned its place in those early, desperate years of the war, but its long-term story wasn't in the air. The real legend of the Vickers K would be written on the ground, in the hands of men who technically weren't even supposed to be using aircraft guns in the first place. The Vickers K didn't just appear from nowhere. It was the result of years of British aircraft gun design, pushed past normal limits. To understand how it fired that fast, you have to understand how its gas system worked and why that big round drum on top wasn't just weird styling. It was the only way to make the whole thing function under those conditions. Most guns of that era operated in one of two ways: recoil operation or gas operation. Classic Vickers ground guns used recoil. The kick of the fired round forced the internal parts to cycle. A gas-operated gun, on the other hand, taps some of the hot expanding gas from the barrel and uses that pressure to drive a piston. That piston throws out the empty case and loads the next round. The Vickers K used a gas-driven action, but with tuning, that made it faster than anything Britain had fielded before. The trick was in how far the bolt group had to travel and how hard the return spring drove it back into battery. Vickers engineers shortened the bolt travel and increased spring pressure. That meant the mechanical cycle finished in a fraction of the usual time. Imagine a sprinter versus a distance runner, short, explosive movement instead of long, slow strokes. The bolt carrier in the Vickers K only had to move about 60% of the distance that an older Lewis gun's parts had to travel, and that alone translated directly into a higher firing speed. Every millisecond taken out of that movement meant more bullets per minute. On top of that, the gas system itself was adjustable. Armorers could tune the regulator depending on what they needed. Dial it one way, and you got a more manageable 9 to 50 rounds per minute for longer bursts. Dial it the other way, remove certain buffer parts, and you could push it toward that insane 2,400 rounds per minute. At that point, you weren't firing so much as creating a stream of lead and praying the target was in front of you. Now let's talk about those pan magazines, because they were both genius and a headache. The Vickers K borrowed the general idea from the Lewis gun. These drums sat flat on top of the gun and used a wound spring like a clock to push rounds toward the feed. The 100-round drum was standard, but lighter. 60-round versions were carried too when weight really mattered. This mattered for one basic reason. Belt-fed guns are fantastic for laying down fire when you're in a fixed position and you're not moving, but they're awful when you're bouncing around. Belts tangle, snag on sharp edges, swallow sand, or just spill everywhere. And usually, somebody else has to guide the belt while you shoot. A drum is self-contained. You pop it on, and you've got 100 rounds ready to go without wrestling a belt in the middle of a fight. For an aircraft gunner crammed into a tiny blister turret, or later for a commando hanging off the side of a racing jeep, that was the difference between I'm firing now and wait, hold on, feed the belt. The wound spring in the drum had to be tensioned before loading. That spring tension kept pushing rounds into the weapon. It usually worked well, but it wasn't perfect. Over time, springs could weaken, and fine desert dust was absolutely brutal on that delicate clockwork feed setup. British armorers in the desert got into the habit of wrapping the drums in cloth and keeping them sealed as tightly as possible between fights. Of course, in the North African desert, dust eventually got into everything anyway. The barrel change setup showed the same kind of thinking. A simple latch let you yank a glowing barrel straight out and slam in a cool spare. At the absolute top firing rates, you could hold down the trigger for maybe 15 seconds before the barrel heated so much that shots started to drift from heat warping. Good gunners learned to fire in short, savage bursts instead of spraying nonstop. 3 to 5 seconds of violence, then off the trigger. By 1940, though, the Vickers K had a problem. It was starting to age out of the job it was invented for. New fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane were single-seat aircraft. They didn't have a rear gunner at all. Bombers that did carry defensive guns were moving toward powered turrets with multiple Brownings, which had longer reach and hit harder at altitude. So the RAF was sitting on piles of Vickers K guns that were on their way to becoming scrap metal. That's when a different kind of soldier took interest. Men who didn't follow normal rules and didn't fight a normal war. They saw a lightweight, unbelievably fast gun that could be used for a totally different style of fighting on the ground. In July 1941, a young officer named David Sterling created the Special Air Service with a new idea. Take small, highly trained teams, sneak them deep behind enemy lines in North Africa, and destroy fuel depots, aircraft on the ground, supply convoys, and infrastructure. Hit the enemy where they slept, not where they were expecting to fight. To do that, he needed speed more than anything. His raiding teams drove modified Willys Jeeps and Chevrolet trucks, moving hundreds of miles across the desert, striking and then disappearing before the enemy could react. That kind of mission needed instant firepower that could be mounted on a vehicle, fired by one man, and unleash pure panic in the first seconds of contact. Standard British infantry weapons weren't giving him that. The Bren gun, while excellent and reliable, shot too slowly for the kind of shock he wanted. The tripod-mounted Vickers medium machine gun was too heavy and needed a team. What Sterling wanted was something a single operator could swivel and fire from a moving truck, something that would drown an enemy position in bullets before the enemy even understood they were under attack. Somewhere in the SAS supply chain, accounts differ on exactly who made the call, someone remembered those spare Vickers K aircraft guns. By late 1941, SAS Jeeps started carrying them. At first, there was usually a single Vickers K on a post mount behind the driver or passenger. The mount let the gunner swing across about 180 degrees so he could hose either side of the Jeep while it was moving. Early raids showed that the idea worked, but Sterling's men immediately pushed it further. If one Vickers K was good, why not two? Why not four? Soon the now iconic SAS Desert Jeeps, often painted in a pale pink beige that blended into the sand at dawn and dusk, were basically rolling gun racks pointed in every direction. A common layout was two Vickers K guns mounted at the front, aimed forward and manned by driver and passenger, plus another twin mount pointing backward, run by a third man in the rear. 4 Vickers K guns on one Jeep, each gun, in theory, capable of over 200 rounds per minute. On paper, that's a combined 4,800 rounds a minute. In real life, nobody fired them flat out non-stop like that because the guns would melt themselves. Instead, teams fired in brutal, controlled bursts to manage heat and ammo. But even short bursts from 4 synchronized guns built an instant wall of lead. The mounts themselves weren't fancy. These weren't precision machine turret rings. They were welded posts and simple pivots, hammered together in workshops in Cairo and Benghazi, often based on hand-sketched ideas from guys who had just come back from a raid. They had to solve several problems at once. The mounts needed to be rock solid while firing, easy to swing toward new targets fast, low enough not to flip the Jeep by raising the center of gravity too high, and tough enough for desert abuse. Armorers solved that by bolting heavy base plates directly through the frame of the Jeep and keeping the guns just high enough to clear the windshield and bodywork. But then came the next problem. Ammo. A 4-gun Jeep, using 100-round drums, needed piles of loaded drums ready to go. Just to be prepared for a short, intense raid, a crew might try to carry a dozen full drums. That's why 200 rounds total. Just that ammunition load easily weighed over 80 pounds, not including the empty drums and the rest of the team's gear. Water, fuel cans, explosives, radios, medical kits. SAS crews jammed magazines into every gap in the vehicle and tied them down with canvas straps and bungee cords. German reporting on Allied gear usually used cold technical naming. The Bren, to them, was basically the English light machine gun. The Thompson submachine gun was just the American machine pistol. But the Vickers K earned something different. In North Africa, German troops started calling it Die Brille, Der Brille, or simply gave it an onomatopoeic nickname, a sound word that tried to copy the ripping noise it made. That alone tells you what kind of impression it left. Sound matters in combat way more than most people think. A single rifle shot is sharp. You can tell roughly where it came from. A slow, heavy machine gun thumping at 450 rounds per minute is scary, sure, but it has a rhythm. You can hear gaps between bursts. You can sometimes time movement between shots. The Vickers K didn't sound like bang, bang, bang. On full rate, it didn't even sound like gunfire in the normal sense. It sounded industrial. It sounded like tearing metal sheeting. It sounded like a giant power tool chewing through steel. It was a mechanical scream. At 100 or 200 rounds per minute, and remember, SAS Jeeps often fired multiple guns at once. Individual shots blurred into one ripping roar. Men who heard it tried to describe it with words like saw, buzzing, ripping, tearing, grinding. Those are words we normally use for machines, not for rifles. The human ear can separate individual sounds up to maybe 10 or 15 distinct events per second. The normal Vickers K setup was putting out 20 rounds per second. The hot-rodded versions were doing 40 per second. Your brain simply couldn't break that down into single shots. All you heard was this unstoppable, rising, metallic growl. The mental effect of that was brutal because the noise accurately warned you what was happening. When you heard that ripping buzz, you knew half a second later that the air around you would be full of bullets. German infantry training focused on aimed fire, calm control, and coordinated movement. But when 4 Vickers K guns opened up at once from fast-moving jeeps, dumping a combined 80 rounds per second into a campsite or airstrip, there was no calm response. There was only hitting the dirt and hoping. Many of the German units in North Africa, including elements of Rommel's Afrika Korps, were experienced soldiers. Some had already fought the Red Army on the Eastern Front. They were not easily rattled. They knew what machine gun fire sounded like, but the Vickers K was different because it combined shock volume with complete surprise. SAS hit-and-run raids were usually launched at night or in the last moments before sunrise, when guards were cold, tired, and visibility was worst. The first sign of trouble wasn't someone shouting. It was the sound. By the time you understood what that sound was, there were already dozens of rounds ripping through tents, fuel drums, parked aircraft, vehicles, and bodies. Italian troops, who made up a large share of Axis manpower in North Africa, were hit even harder psychologically. Italian infantry doctrine in 1941-42 expected static defense, dug-in positions, steady fire. They trained for holding ground, not fighting swarms of speeding jeeps rolling in from nowhere, spraying overwhelming fire, and vanishing. Captured Italian officers wrote after-action notes talking about the British raiders with the tearing sound gun and how that specific noise wrecked morale. There's real biology behind this. The human startle reflex, that automatic flinch when something explodes nearby, takes roughly 0.15 to 0.2 seconds to fire. At 1 to 100 rounds per minute, the Vickers K is throwing 3 or 4 bullets during that same window. In the time it takes your body to react to the first instant of noise, more rounds have already hit. You literally cannot react fast enough. That helplessness, that feeling that your nervous system cannot keep up, is part of why the gun's reputation grew so fast. That's also why the nickname itself matters. The weapon stopped being just a machine gun and turned into almost a presence. When frontline soldiers invent new slang just to talk about one enemy weapon, that weapon has carved itself into their memory. One of the first major SAS raids with Vickers K armed jeeps happened on December 14, 1941, against Axis airfields at Sirte and Tamimi in Libya. The basic idea was bold but simple. Drive deep behind enemy lines, hit airfields while the planes were neatly parked, engines off, surrounded by fuel and bombs, and then get out before the defenders could pull together a serious counterattack. That first strike wrecked or damaged around 24 German and Italian aircraft on the ground. It proved the concept. From that point on, this stopped being an experiment and became a method. But the attack that really showed what the Vickers K could do took place on July 26, 1942, at Sidi Hanaish Airfield in Egypt. Sterling himself led 18 jeeps. Each jeep was bristling with multiple Vickers K guns. Intelligence said the base held a large number of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The convoy navigated more than 150 miles of open desert and darkness using nothing but compass bearings, timing the arrival for just before dawn. That timing mattered. Guards are at their lowest alert right before sunup, and planes are usually fueled and armed for the morning's missions. The assault kicked off around 01:30 hours. The jeeps rolled in line abreast at full throttle. Every gun was already firing. Imagine 70 or more Vickers K barrels all going at once. Men there later described the sound as physically painful, a solid wall of noise that swallowed every other sound, shouting, engines, even explosions. Each jeep had its own lane of targets. Gunners swept their fire across rows of parked aircraft, trucks full of fuel, ammo stacks, tents, vehicles, and anyone who ran. The crazy high rate of fire meant even very short bursts would slice apart control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, and touch off secondary detonations. The whole raid lasted under 15 minutes. By the time German anti-aircraft crews got their bearings and ran to their guns, the SAS jeeps were already leaving, dissolving back into the desert. After sunrise, German officers walked the field and started counting. They reported roughly 37 aircraft destroyed, mostly Stukas and 109s, and another dozen damaged too badly to fly soon. Fuel stores were burning, and the runway area was covered in spent 303 brass. One German estimate said the raiders had fired over 50,000 rounds in that single attack. This wasn't nuisance raiding. This was industrial destruction carried out by fewer than 80 men with improvised gun trucks. What happened at Sidi Hanaish became the model. Between July 1941 and October 1942, SAS teams using jeeps armed with Vickers K guns destroyed or damaged more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa. To understand how insane that is, at that stage of the war, Allied air forces were still struggling to win consistent air superiority in that theater. And here was a tiny special unit using obsolete aircraft guns on jeeps, racking up kills like an entire fighter squadron, without losing a single pilot or bomber crew. In September 1942, an SAS raid on Benghazi harbor showed another use for the same weapon. This time, Jeeps didn't just chew up airfields, they drove into port areas and opened fire on Italian supply ships, fuel stores, dock gear, anything keeping Rommel's Africa Corps supplied. Lieutenant Colonel Paddy Mayne, who would later command the SAS, ran that strike with about a dozen Jeeps. Quad-mounted Vickers K guns swept the harbor for nearly 20 minutes. Fires burned for days, and critical supplies headed for the front were wiped out just before the build-up to the Second Battle of El Alamein. The psychological effect of these raids started to matter as much as the physical damage. German and Italian commanders were forced to pull aircraft back from forward airstrips, scatter them across wider areas, assign more guards, and spend time and manpower on defense instead of offense. Intelligence in late 1942 reported that some Luftwaffe airfields in North Africa were now guarded by entire infantry companies, men who were desperately needed at the actual front lines where Montgomery's 8th Army was preparing its push. Now here's a point most shooting range purists hate. Accuracy is overrated in certain missions. The Vickers K was not a sniper's weapon. At full cyclic rate, the vibration and recoil made precise, single-point hits almost impossible. An expert marksman looking for tight groups would look at that and say, "This is garbage." But that thinking misses what the SAS understood perfectly. In a raid, winning the first 5 seconds is more important than hitting the exact center of a target. Suppression, making the enemy keep their head down and fail to respond, is more valuable than surgical accuracy when you're blowing up parked planes or fuel trucks. Picture a German sentry at an airfield. He suddenly faces 4 Jeeps, each with multiple Vickers K guns, all firing at once. That's roughly 80 rounds per second filling the area around him. Even if most of those bullets don't actually hit him, the remaining rounds are tearing into aircraft wings, puncturing fuel drums, setting off ammunition, kicking up dirt and sparks all around his body. His Mauser rifle is accurate and deadly, in theory, but he can't lift his head long enough to aim. That is suppression. The .303 British cartridge the Vickers K fired was perfect for this. It wasn't some massive, heavy anti-tank round. It didn't have to be. Parked planes are skinned in thin aluminum, often barely a couple of millimeters thick. Fuel trucks have thin metal tanks. Ammunition crates are wood. Tents are canvas. Almost everything on a forward airstrip is fragile. You don't need a cannon to wreck that. You just need a flood of rifle-caliber shots hitting it fast enough. Now, compare that with German MG-34s and MG-42s. Those guns were legendary. The MG-42 especially had a terrifying rate of fire, usually around 1,200 rounds per minute. On paper, that matches a standard Vickers K. But the German guns were belt-fed and heavier, and they were built around sustained fire from fixed positions with supporting crews. They were brilliant defensive machine guns, but they weren't designed to be swung around by one guy while a Jeep bounced across sand at 40 miles per hour. That's where the Vickers K's drum system mattered. A single gunner could run it alone, even on rough ground. No assistant gunner needed to hold a belt, no tripod to set up. Just grab, point, fire. Out of this grew a style of fighting built around short, savage bursts instead of long, steady fire. Experienced SAS gunners learned to fire in bursts of 3 to 5 seconds. That's 60 to 100 rounds per gun at normal fire rate or 200 rounds at extreme rate. Those bursts were long enough to completely saturate a target zone, but short enough that the barrel didn't immediately warp and melt. When 4 guns on one Jeep fired these bursts together, they could drop around 400 rounds to a 50-meter patch of target area in 5 seconds. Nothing sitting in that space survived. There was another major benefit. It reduced the amount of training time needed. Teaching high-level, precise marksmanship takes weeks or months. Teaching someone to point a Vickers K towards where the enemy is and squeeze the trigger takes a few hours and a strong stomach. The SAS selected for aggression, stamina, and the ability to function under stress, not for formal marksmanship scores. The sheer output of the Vickers K made up for any lack of fine aim. The chaos these guns created spread beyond the immediate kill zone. During raids on convoys or air bases, troops who weren't even under direct fire could still hear the ripping roar, see tracers slicing through the dark, and watch vehicles and planes turning into bonfires. That shock froze people. An October 1942 German report described this effect as paralyzing. Units that actually outnumbered the raiders still failed to organize counterattacks in time, simply because they were overwhelmed in the first seconds. But every weapon has limits. The Vickers K ran into 3 big ones: heat, ammo, and the changing shape of the war. By late 1943, the gun that had terrified Axis forces all over the desert was starting to disappear from frontline use. The first and worst problem was heat. At 200 rounds per minute, you're dumping 20 bullets every second. Each fired round brings chamber temperatures into the thousands of degrees Celsius. The Vickers K was light, about 21 pounds, which also meant it didn't have a lot of extra metal to soak up and spread out that heat. After 15 or 20 seconds of non-stop fire, the barrel could get so hot that it caused cook-offs, where the heat alone ignited the cartridge in the chamber before the trigger was pulled. That meant the gun could start firing on its own. The quick-change barrel feature helped, but it wasn't magic. In the middle of a firefight, swapping a glowing barrel takes time you might not have. SAS teams carried spare barrels, but if you had 4 guns on one Jeep all heating up, you physically couldn't baby all of them at once. Skilled gunners learned to rotate fire between guns and use short bursts, but that level of discipline under fire isn't easy. The second problem was pure hunger. A 100-round drum lasted about 5 seconds at normal high rate. At extreme rate, more like 2.5. A Jeep with 4 guns could burn through a frightening amount of ammo in a minute. So to stay effective even for a short raid, crews had to carry 20 or more full drums, easily 2,000 rounds. That's roughly 160 pounds of ammunition and magazines before you even pack water, fuel, medical kits, explosives, maps, radios, and personal gear. As raids went deeper and deeper behind enemy lines, keeping that much ammo supplied became harder. There was also the accuracy drop-off from heat warping. A cool Vickers K firing controlled bursts could be reasonably accurate out to a few hundred meters. A red-hot barrel, slightly bent from heat, sprayed bullets in wider and wider patterns. That didn't matter much when you were hosing parked planes at 50 meters. But as the war shifted and more firefights happened at longer distances against prepared positions, that spread started to hurt usefulness. And the battlefield itself was changing. After El Alamein in November 1942, and after the Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, the North African campaign ended. The fight moved into Italy and then into Northwest Europe. That terrain was nothing like the open Sahara. Italian towns, stone villages, tight mountain passes, French hedgerows, and German forests didn't give Jeeps the same freedom to dash in, unload, and escape. Luftwaffe air bases in Europe weren't isolated strips in the sand anymore. They had layered defenses, heavier anti-aircraft guns, and fast response units nearby. The guns themselves were aging too. Remember, these were weapons built in the mid-1930s for short defensive bursts from aircraft in relatively clean air. By 1943, many of those same guns had been hammered for years in desert fighting. Sand wore out moving parts, springs got tired, gas systems suffered. The delicate drum mechanisms jammed more often. British armorers across the world were already stretched, keeping millions of weapons running. Keeping a few hundred elderly aircraft guns alive just for special raiders started getting harder to justify. By late 1943, Special Forces units began receiving the Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun. The Browning fired slower, usually around 450 to 550 rounds per minute, which was less than half the Vickers K's normal rate. But each .50 caliber round hit like a hammer. It carried far more energy and stayed lethal at ranges out to 1,500 meters. Against tougher German vehicles, concrete positions, and hardened targets, raw striking power mattered more than spray volume. The M2 was also incredibly rugged, stayed reliable in rough conditions, and could fire longer without cooking itself to death. Jump ahead to 1972. At General Electric, an American engineer named Richard Carl, often credited in development work on the program, is finishing tests on the GAU-8A Avenger, a 7-barrel rotary cannon built for the new A-10 Thunderbolt II close air support jet. Test pilots described its voice as a deep, ugly growl, a low, ripping snarl that anyone who's ever heard an A-10 remembers instantly. If that sounds familiar, it should. In a way, the Vickers K invented that exact kind of terror 35 years earlier, and the thinking behind both weapons is basically the same. Sometimes the sound of overwhelming firepower is itself a weapon. The GRU-8 fires around 3,900 rounds per minute, roughly 65 rounds per second, from a 30mm cannon system that weighs hundreds of pounds and spits high explosive armor-piercing shells. It's obviously a completely different scale than a 21-pound .303 caliber gun from the 1930s. But listen to recordings of both at full rate. You'll hear the same continuous ripping buzz, the same flat mechanical scream that doesn't sound like separated gunshots. That's not an accident. Both weapons cross the limit where the rate of fire is faster than human hearing can process as individual shots. Your brain stops hearing bang, 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 and instead hears BRRRRRT. That BRRRRRT tells everyone on the ground that they are about to have a very, very bad day. And the tactics are almost the same concept, just in different eras. The A-10's job is to fly low over a battlefield and break enemy positions, vehicles, and equipment so violently that ground troops can move. Pilots don't try to place single perfect bullets. They point the entire nose of the jet at an area and fire in 1 to 2 second bursts. In that time, 65 to 130 explosive rounds hit an area about the size of a tennis court. That is area suppression from the air. The exact same idea Sterling's SAS used from jeeps in the desert: saturate the target so hard, so fast, that answering fire never really starts. Modern soldiers who've been on the receiving end of A-10 gun runs, even during training, describe that same freezing effect that German troops talked about in 1942. The sound doesn't feel like gunfire. It feels like a physical force slamming over you. Iraqi forces in the Gulf War nicknamed the A-10 things like the Devil's Cross, partly because of its silhouette and partly because of what that sound meant was coming. This idea, overwhelmed through volume and shock, not finesse, runs through modern doctrine. The concept of recon by fire, where you shoot into likely hiding spots to force enemies to react, depends on throwing a lot of lead into an area fast. The modern minigun, a 6-barrel rotary gun capable of 4,000, 6,000 rounds per minute, fills almost the exact same role on helicopters that the Vickers K filled on SAS Jeeps. You use a mobile platform to drown the target zone so completely in the opening seconds that return fire dies in the throat. There's even a direct connection in special operations tactics. Modern special operations forces around the world still use fast raiding vehicles, gun trucks, modified Humvees, light strike vehicles, loaded with high rate of fire weapons like miniguns, heavy Brownings, and automatic grenade launchers. The formula Sterling wrote is still the formula. Move fast, hit first, hit harder than you should be able to with such a small team, and then disappear before the enemy can react. Speed, shock, and volume. That's the DNA. By 1945, the Vickers K itself was fading out. Some of the remaining guns were shipped east and saw use in Burma, mounted on long-range patrol jeeps used by units like the Chindits. A handful survived in armories after the war and were passed to colonial forces and some police units into the 1950s. Most of the rest were scrapped or sold off. Working, transferable Vickers K guns today are extremely rare, and collectors will pay huge money to get one. But the sound, that ripping, buzzing BRRRRT, stayed. And that sound stands for a simple truth the Vickers K helped prove. In a fight, the psychological shock of unstoppable, continuous fire can matter just as much as the physical destruction. That fear, that instant loss of control, can break units before the bullets even land. From the deserts of North Africa in 1941 and 1942 to the streets and battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan decades later, that lesson stayed relevant. The Vickers K was already considered outdated by 1943, but the doctrine it helped create, and the noise it made, is still echoing across modern war 8 decades later.